Alright guys, we are back in my garage for another video, and today we're going to talk about replacement parts. And this time, a lot of it's going to be about aftermarket parts, but not the kind of ones where you're trying to upgrade and make more power, with aftermarket exhausts and turbos and stuff like that. We're going to talk about OEM replacements that come from companies that aren't BMW. And I think this is something that confuses a lot of you, and you guys have asked me about certain parts. If you can save money by buying the cheapest one, or do you need to spend the absolute most and make sure it's OEM? There are so many different opinions around this stuff, and I just wanted to share some things that we've learned over time to help you understand and maybe make a better educated decision when you're going to replace parts on your car, whether it's something that broke and you need to fix it, or just something that you're doing as preventative maintenance. So let's go ahead and dive into it in this video, and hopefully you guys find it useful.
Now, as always, for everybody that's new to the channel, I create these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future.
So the main thing that you need to understand and concept coming from this video is that BMW assembles all of their cars, but BMW does not make any of the parts that are assembled on their cars. All of the components come from separate manufacturers that they basically contract to make parts for their vehicles. Then they ship it to their manufacturing plants, assemble it, and sell it to us as a complete car. So, for example, I've worked on both sides of the automotive space. I've worked on the OEM level as well as on the supplier level. It's a very seamless process. Most people really don't lose sleep about it in the actual engineering side of things, but definitely on the consumer end, there's a lot of scrutiny around OEM parts, aftermarket parts, which supplier you're buying from, and things like that. So I understand it can definitely get very confusing. Now, as a supplier to BMW, if they make, 100,000 of a certain type of vehicle a year, you'll ship parts to them to meet that demand, but you'll also ship additional parts to a service center. And the service center is basically going to store all the components. So if a dealership ever needs to replace it, they can order from them. If like a body shop or somebody that's working on insurance repairs needs to order replacement parts, they can purchase from them. And then of course, we can also do that as well. We have a lot of online vendors that either stock or can order OEM parts so that we can repair parts on our vehicles. So that's kind of like the streamlined process to think about, because when you're buying an OEM part, really it's just a supplier that shipped it to BMW, it was repackaged, and then purchased by us at a higher cost. Now, I won't say that the OEM label or being an OEM part has absolutely no meaning. In reality, the OEM is going to define like the quality requirements for how the supplier works. They'll set all the design specifications and things like that. And if you pay attention in the aftermarket space, usually there's more suppliers than you would expect. BMW for each component probably has one supplier, maybe two at most. So when you look up something and you see 8 or 10 different versions of the same part, it can be a little bit confusing to figure out which ones are high enough quality at a cheaper cost where you may not need to actually pay extra for the OEM part. So I do still recommend buying from an OEM supplier or the original supplier for that specific component, but it definitely varies depending on what you're talking about. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the parts that we more commonly replace on our cars. A big one is spark plugs, which I know I've talked about countless times on this, but the main OEM suppliers for the B58 are NGK and Champion. So those are usually the two that I recommend. If you buy an OEM plug from BMW, it'll actually be a nice little random generator. You don't know which one you're going to get until you actually open the box. So in this case, I actually recommend buying the actual aftermarket or parts directly from the supplier instead of buying them from BMW. It's not going to be the end of the world if you have a mixed bag. I know a lot of people say they go to replace their spark plugs and they find 3 of one and 3 of the other, and their last spark plug replacement was at the dealer. So how could this happen? But in reality, that's how it works. If they just pull 6 boxes off of the shelf, they don't know whether they're NGK or Champion, and they're not going to sort through it to make sure all 6 are the same. So in my opinion, if you want to make sure you have all 6 of the same plugs in your car, definitely order it from a company that sells them directly so that you can make sure you're getting all the same plugs. I do not recommend buying plugs like the Bosch versions that you might see listed on some websites as fitting our cars. The reason is because Bosch plugs are double platinum, while the Champion and NGK plugs are iridium. And iridium is a higher quality spark plug. It can handle more heat and it can take a better beating. So I would not downgrade to a Bosch plug, even though it might be the same thread pattern or whatever and technically the right heat range. Go with the iridium plug. It'll last longer, especially because we've seen people blow motors from spark plugs breaking and stuff due to excessive heat. It's just not really something that I would play with. And I'm not necessarily saying that's an issue with Bosch plugs or something that happens, but it is a potential issue, and I wouldn't chance it by, going with a different plug. The other concern I want to mention is I would not buy these plugs from somewhere like Amazon or eBay. I would try to make sure that I'm buying them directly from a distributor that is authorized by NGK and Champion so that you know you're getting genuine plugs. There are fakes out there, especially for NGK, and people sell them on some of these other websites, and when you put them in your car, they might not last as long. Again, they might come apart when the engine gets hot. It might work at stock power levels, but as you're pushing it, it could cause misfires and things like that. So make sure that you're buying genuine NGK or Champion plugs from a distributor that's authorized to sell them. Next, let's talk about coil packs. And by this point, I think I've posted the video probably a week or so before this one, but for coil packs, I recommend getting Elder coils. The reason is because they are the OEM manufacturer and you can get them cheaper than the actual OEM version. So it'll be the exact same as the ones that came from BMW, just without the BMW logo, and it'll come in a different box. The ones that I got came in this BBT box. For whatever reason, Elder actually doesn't have a service division that sells directly to distribution companies. They only sell them directly to BMW. So it seems like they've licensed BBT to sell these in the aftermarket space, and that's what I ended up replacing the coil packs with on my 440i. Next, let's talk about fueling. So a lot of you guys are replacing injectors, or maybe you want to upgrade or replace your high pressure fuel pump. So all of the fuel system OEM upgrades and parts from our cars come directly from Bosch. So Bosch actually has a huge chokehold on the high pressure fuel system market right now. You can actually look at a lot of different brands, and if you look at their engines and their fueling setups, you'll see they'll have 1 or 2 TU pumps. They look exactly the same as the ones that we have on our cars. So they are all over the place at this point. That makes them a lot cheaper than if you were to buy them from the OEM or from the dealership. So in this case, again, I highly recommend if you're replacing or upgrading your high pressure fuel pump with a stock or TU pump, or if you're replacing your injectors, just buy the Bosch version. It is the exact same as OEM at half, if not less than half, of the price of the OEM unit. Next, let's talk about coolant. And this is something where I do fall back and recommend OEM. For one, it's so readily available, especially if you have a dealership within, a reasonable distance. They always are super stocked on coolant and have it readily available. Also, that gallon of coolant is about like $20 to $25, and you can make 2 full gallons of coolant. So it goes for a really long time, stretches really far, and it's relatively cheap, and you don't have to wait for shipping and stuff like that. Now, if you're stranded out somewhere where you're not close to a dealership and you can only get to like an AutoZone or something like that, there are other coolants that work. Usually they'll specify on the coolant bottle that it's a European mix or European formula, and that's usually what I recommend. The reason why it's critical to get the right one is because it's not just doing cooling. Actually, the coolant additive doesn't do much cooling. Majority of what it does is giving you freeze protection so that your water won't freeze in the winter, and also it has additives that help lubricate components in your car and things like that. So I try not to mix it with other aftermarket solutions. If I can, I'll probably just run distilled water, especially if it's like the summer and stuff and I'm not worried about it freezing. But if you do get yourself stuck in a pinch, you can replace with like a different version, and then usually when I get home, I'll just flush it and fill it up with OEM. Next, let's talk about oil. And I know there are countless brands out there that everybody is super faithful to, so I'm just going to share my opinion as well as BMW's perspective. So the B58 Gen 1 and Gen 2 is required to run LL01FE oil. There are a lot of different weights and a lot of different brands that fall under the specification, but keep in mind the spec is something that an aftermarket oil company can pay to get their oils tested so that it's certified to meet that spec. If an oil company decides not to pay to get their oil certified, it could meet that spec, but some companies could have paid and it didn't meet the cert, or they didn't pay to do the testing and it doesn't meet the cert. So that's why, for my peace of mind, I just try to make sure that it has that certification, so I know it has all the properties and everything that BMW deems required and appropriate for the B58 engine. There are a lot of different options out there. I run Liqui-Moly 0W30 in both of my cars. I've ran 0W20 OEM oil for years. I made over 500 wheel horsepower with it, no issues. I've also ran 5W40, again, making over 500, even 600 wheel horsepower, no issues. So lots of different options there, but that's just my preference, as well as something that's readily available to me to run in my car. There are also other options that BMW actually lists as a qualified on their oils. There's Liqui-Moly 5W30, Motul 5W30, and Titan 5W30. So those are ones that they actually have listed in their documentation as OEM approved oils. I think Motul is probably one of the other really popular brands now that people are switching to, so that's definitely a good one to try. Now, if you're changing your oil, you're also going to want to change your oil filter. And although these are pretty cheap, this is another situation where the OEM version isn't made by BMW. It's made by a company called UFI. So if you buy the UFI filter and run it in your car, it's going to be the same as OEM. I know some people are a little bit hesitant to run it because some people have had issues with the oil filter coming apart in their B58. So when they try to remove it, the filter basically separates and you have to use like a pick tool or something to peel it all out of the oil filter housing. I've never had that issue even with the OEM filter that was on my car, but I do run man filters. That's something that I've run on all of my European cars for a long time. I've had great luck with it. They are an OEM supplier for multiple other engines, especially like Volkswagens. They make a lot of the Volkswagen filters. But for me, I've also run it in my B58, in my N52. You know, I just pretty much run it for everything, and I trust the brand. So lots of options out there. Another one is Mahle. They make oil filters as well, and that's also a highly qualified brand to work with. Speaking of Mahle, they're actually the OEM supplier for intake filters. So if you're going to be replacing your intake filter as well, just buy the Mahle version. Again, save yourself a couple bucks. Not super expensive to get the OEM one, but since it's so readily available and cheaper, I definitely recommend that one. Now, the last thing, and probably what I should have touched on first, but I know this isn't a regular maintenance item. This is something that's a little more like people replace it if something goes wrong, but it's your valve cover. And a lot of you guys actually reached out to me asking me to touch on this because the valve cover is something that is very critical to your emission system, but it also needs to be able to handle the extra performance you're asking from your car. Your valve cover has the PCV integrated with check valves that basically open and close different areas of your PCV routing, depending on if you're in boost or not. If you are in boost and you're making enough pressure, you can damage the internals of your valve cover, and that can cause issues with pushing oil, causing misfires, and things like that. So if your valve cover is broken and you're replacing it, please replace it with OEM. What a lot of people have experienced is if they replace it with aftermarket solutions like the one from Febi, when they put it on their cars, it seems to idle and drive okay, but when they get into boost, it causes misfires. And the reason it seems like some of the internals inside of the valve cover are okay for like stock boost levels and regular driving, but if you're running higher than stock boost, or especially with like an upgraded turbo, it can overwhelm these aftermarket valve covers. So I know from the outside they look the same as OEM, but something internal definitely is not the same. I haven't actually been able to identify the OEM supplier from BMW, so that's why I tell people just buy the OEM version so that you know you're buying the right one. On my 340i, I feel like that might have been one of the issues, and I did end up replacing the valve cover because it was having misfires when I got it, and we just couldn't figure out why. And that's when I did the valve cover replacement, the PCV delete, and I plugged the head ports, and then my misfires went away. So definitely be wary of running an aftermarket OEM replacement valve cover. I just recommend getting the OEM version. I know it's pretty expensive, but too many people have spent weeks and weeks, if not months, trying to chase a ghost that was just because they replaced their valve cover with an aftermarket one. So yeah, I could make this video even longer. Obviously, there are a lot of parts on our cars that get replaced over time. Let me know if there's anything specific that you want me to touch on, and I can probably bring it up in a future video, but I thought these were some of the more typical parts that we replace with regular maintenance and things like that to hopefully help guide you guys on what kind of parts you should be running. So yeah, I think that's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.